Hi, I'm Olivia.
And I'm Amy.
And this is a Girls in Marketing podcast. Every week, we release a new episode that you won't want to miss. Our guests are industry experts with amazing experiences, so you'll always come away with new nuggets of wisdom. From educational and inspiring episodes covering the latest in digital marketing to casual and fun chats with the Girls in Marketing team, unpacking marketing myths and trends, we've got it all.
Here at Girls in Marketing, we're all about empowering and supporting women to be the best marketers they can be through our online learning platform and community. Check out our resources and membership to get involved, as we'd love to welcome you to our inner circle.
Right, let's dive into an episode together. Hello and welcome back to the Girls in Marketing podcast. Today we're back with a brand new snack episode. Happy International Women's Day. We thought it'd be great to do an episode all dedicated to International Women's Day, since that's something that we're all about here at Girls in Marketing. The theme for this year's International Women's Day is Embrace Equity. And I just wanted a snack episode because obviously we're an all-female team with Girls in Marketing. We're very much about advocating for women in the workplace, how to be an ally for women. We talk a lot to women. That's our kind of biggest audience. In fact, I think it's like 96% of people who listen to this podcast are women. And a stat that I have quite a few issues with, actually, is the fact that more women than men work in marketing, but more men have senior positions than women. So I just thought that we can discuss that today, maybe give some people some tips on how to advocate for themselves, and just embrace equity as the theme is.
Yeah, absolutely. That really frustrates me as well. I know we've spoken about this before, kind of in the office and things like that, and it's a really infuriating stat. And I also read on the International Women's Day website something very similar, which is quite interesting, in that apparently something like women are they're kind of in a race against the clock, in that if they don't reach a level of seniority, apparently within like sort of their first 10 years of their career, they're really like less likely to. Whereas men are kind of the other way and tend to reach more senior positions maybe a little bit later, or like that progression to senior positions doesn't slow down as much for them.
Right.
And I think there's probably a lot of reasons for that. And, you know, obviously that's what we're kind of wanting to talk about today. And I think one of the main ones is that for women, depending on what they want to do, you know, if they want to kind of start families and things like that, the traditional kind of role for women in kind of heterosexual relationships, you know, obviously it's not the case with all, but the traditional kind of role of women is, you know, having children, dedicating some of their time to bringing up children, you know, being kind of like a carer, whether it's part-time carer for children, and, you know, as a result, putting some of their time in their careers on hold. And I think that traditionally has kind of been the way that it looked, because obviously more historically men would be like the breadwinners and things. So that was what women did. But we're kind of getting to a point where, you know, more and more women are wanting to kind of remain in the workforce when they have children, have the flexibility to start families, but still pursue their careers. And I think that one of the biggest barriers for women in doing that is that generally when women are kind of getting to the stage in their career that they're, you know, reaching levels of seniority is maybe around the time they're thinking about starting families. And if their employer gives them the flexibility to maybe, you know, have children and then have the flexibility in terms of where they work, allowing remote work, allowing flexibility in their working hours, accommodating for, you know, the new kind of family dynamic that they've maybe started, there should be no reason that women can't still progress in their careers, do great things, bring the knowledge and the skill that they have, whilst also starting a family and having a family. And I do think that is a huge kind of barrier for women. And it's something that I think that, you know, organisations today aren't necessarily adapting to quickly enough. And that's why, like you said, we see far more women in the marketing and PR industry, but they're being hurdled and like leapfrogged by men, because it's when they're getting to positions when they could get into a senior role, they're like, oh, but now I want to start a family. And it's like, I have to choose. And it just shouldn't be the case.
Yeah. It's almost that choice, isn't it?
Yeah. I seen a stat on LinkedIn. It was like a graph that was kind of saying about women, and it was kind of having children. It was salaries between men and women. It wasn't specifically in the marketing industry. It was just kind of like in general. And it was basically showing women and men like more or less equal up until that age of around kind of like 30s kind of age, where women, it just goes down quite significantly. Men, it still says with kids, so men still have the kids at that point. They just don't necessarily go down. And then the salary, what happens is the women goes down, but then like tapers off, but it's still below the men. So they were like equal for all of that time. And then they kind of have children or whatever. Obviously not every woman does necessarily, but that typically is the kind of where the gap comes from. It's that element of the like the gender pay gap, isn't it?
Yeah.
And so many people say, oh, it doesn't exist or it does exist and all these sorts of things. But actually it's that significant part of the fact of like, typically, I mean, I did that podcast episode with Lydia Infante quite a while ago now, but it's a really interesting listen if
really
anyone
good
wants to
one,
go and listen to it. And she talks a lot about that element of, you know, women being the caregivers and the people who look after the home and stuff like
traditional
that.
gender roles.
Traditional
and stuff,
gender roles and everything like that. And the stat that I seen on LinkedIn was just so shocking, because you can see that spike where at that point they're both the same, and then all of a sudden it's just not, and it never becomes the same again, which is so crazy.
And I think it's also, like you said, not all women want to have families, but I think what does still happen is that even when women are approaching that age, it's like if people are in positions with, you know, power over hiring decisions, if they're predominantly men, because obviously, like we've said, a lot of the time more men are senior in kind of the marketing industry. If they're men, they may kind of be having those things of, if she's around, like, you know, this person's around that age, or is that something they're going to be thinking about? Would it be a safer decision for the long term to hire a man? Are they less likely to want to go off and have kids, to want to go part-time? And like, is that ingrained in their decision-making process, even subconsciously? And that's a barrier that we need to break down. Yeah,
I think there is a lot of bias about it. And I think it was last year that the actual theme of International Women's Day was break the bias. I think it was, wasn't it?
It was,
which I really thought that was a good one. And I think the bias has a lot of element in it in terms of when women do get to the age that perhaps they do want to start a family, or it's kind of society kind of expects them to kind of start a family. I think there's that bias that comes into it by people, like it could be of any gender, and people are kind of like, oh, is she like, where are the kids at this point? But like no one ever asked the men where the kids are. So it's kind of like that bias, having that in the head and kind of,
absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think another thing is for, you know, women in the marketing industry who are maybe kind of earlier in their careers, one super important thing that I think would really help and, you know, allow more women to aspire to get to senior positions. Not that the reason that they're not is because they're not aspirational, but kind of give them that confidence that they can get there, is having more women in those positions who are role models for them.
Yeah.
Obviously, we need to be allowing women to get there, but the more women that are there, the more other women kind of see that it can be done, and like that kind of path is forged for them. And there's that, you know, yes, this can be done. We've got, you know, women role models in these positions, and I think so that's really super important, because, you know, we're kind of, we've got to address the issue like early on. Like, women have got to kind of be in positions where younger kind of people entering the industry see that it's an opportunity and a possibility for them. I mean, how often when you think of a boardroom would you think of like a room of men? And like changing that stereotype and getting more women in that room allows for other women, and not only other women, but, you know, men even, to kind of see women as being in that position. It's that typical stereotype of like, you know, when people say like, okay, you think of a net, like there was a campaign on it, wasn't there?
It comes back to that bias again, doesn't it? I think it was Imagine London, I think it was called, who did that campaign last year on International Women's Day, and it was all about like, imagine a nurse. Is it a woman?
Man or a woman?
Imagine someone leaving the office early to pick up the kids. Is it man or a woman? And it really does like make you question your own bias and your own beliefs, and just kind of question yourself and kind of correct yourself in them situations.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's so important. And I think not only being role models in the sense of like reaching senior positions, but as women, you know, doing what we can when we when we are in those positions to really make an impact. And it's again, it's that thing of like, I feel like we're coming back to, you know, women having to do things and advocate for themselves. And it will come, I think, on a little bit to kind of how people can be allies with women as well. But I think for anyone listening who wants to be an advocate for themselves or for other women that they work with, it's so super important to remember that, you know, you can be an advocate for yourself, but also for, you know, any women in your team, anyone that you manage. Again, like you said before about the episode with Lydia, I recorded a really great podcast episode a while back now with Ruth Hartnell from Matchstick Creative. And Ruth talks a lot about kind of this idea of, you know, supporting other women, being the voice for them when they need it. And I think we've all probably experienced at some point or another, you know, maybe not being able to speak up on something or not feeling like we could, and feeling like I'd love someone to be there and give that voice and speak up against maybe, you know, a stereotype or, you know, whatever it is. And Ruth talks about that a lot, and about kind of when you get to a point in your career where you can use your voice, like using it for good to empower other women. So that's definitely a tip that I think, you know, we can all take on board more, you know, if you've got the confidence and you know, and you feel comfortable, then definitely speak up for yourself. But sometimes, and I think Ruth says this in the podcast, sometimes it can be easier to feel confident speaking up for somebody else.
Yeah, that's what I really thought, that she said that, and be the person to like stop them and say, actually, no, she wasn't finished. So and like I say, I think as you are younger in your career, I think it kind of is easier to do that for other people, but obviously as you progress, it kind of does get easier to do that for yourself, and it does come with time to kind of advocate for yourself in that way.
Yeah, absolutely.
No, I agree. And I think the thing is, people don't realise that actually, as long as you've got the evidence and what you're saying is like correct, no one's going to question it. So, you know, you might be sat in a meeting room full of people, and maybe you want to say something, or maybe you want to bring something up. In that case, a lot of the time, people can be quite scared, and, you know, especially if you are a junior person or kind of just getting started in your career, you've got maybe an idea or something like that. I remember the first time I was working in a full-time role, and I was in a meeting full of people, and I had an idea, and I was sat there and I was like, oh, I really want to say something, and I sat on it for ages, and I didn't say anything in that meeting, and I really regretted it afterwards. And then I kind of went away, chatted to my manager like on a one-to-one, and then the next time, at the next meeting, I brought it up, and I felt a lot more confident. And I think the reason that I didn't was just because I was like so unsure of the idea, because it was an idea that I just had on the spot. We were talking about something that we like, a new upcoming thing that we were doing, and it was just kind of like, oh yeah, I've got this idea. But because I was relatively new to the role, and I was new to like the industry as well, I was kind of like, oh, I don't know, like, is it my place to say? And I think it's about not questioning if it's your place to say, because you're in that role, you've got that job, and so many people question that. They're like, oh, but you know, what if I'm in this job and I get it, like it's good, but you're in that job for a reason. You've got that job. You're on that salary for a reason. You know, you've been recruited by someone. You went through this whole hiring process. You're in the position you're in right now because they know that you can do the job. And, you know, those ideas that you're going to bring to the table are great. Like, okay, sometimes, you know, and I've put forward strategies and campaigns before that haven't worked. And as much as it's a bit embarrassing to be like, yeah, I know it was my idea, but it happens, and that's
you learn
fine.
from it at the end of the day, don't you?
Yeah. And I think people are just sometimes quite anxious to do that, and it's just about, okay, actually saying to yourself, right, I know this idea is a really good one, telling yourself in your head, and just doing it and putting it forward.
And I think, so obviously, you know, what we've talked about so far is kind of in relation to, you know, women being able to advocate for themselves more, have that confidence in the workplace. Obviously, you know, there are things that are, you know, barriers for us that aren't necessarily within our control. So I think that it's also important to discuss how people, you know, can be allies for women in the workplace as well. And I think one really important thing is for, you know, anyone who, you know, isn't a woman, to kind of acknowledge like any privilege that they have, and any kind of maybe challenges that they don't face themselves, that maybe women, you know, their female women equivalents in the workplace do. And I think that, you know, even just kind of reflecting on that, you know, is a huge thing. Reflecting on that, acknowledging it. You know, if you're in a position where you're hiring people, you know, understanding any subconscious biases that you may have as well, and being aware of those things. Like, do you have an unconscious bias that kind of makes you think that it's quite a risk to hire a woman who is kind of in their late 20s, early 30s, mid 30s, and thinking, oh, well, they're going to be off, having kids soon, and I'm going to have to recruit again. Like, do you have these thoughts, even if they're not found in anything, even if they're not true? Check yourself more, when you know that you've got opportunities to, give women a voice, give them an opportunity to speak, give them a chance to share their ideas. Like we said before about, when as a woman, you can kind of speak up for other women and say, they weren't finished speaking, let them talk. You can do that as well. Like, men can do that you can speak up and say, actually, let's give this person like the opportunity to speak. Just be aware of, I guess, the challenges that women face that maybe you don't.
Yeah.
And I think that it really will kind of change your perspective on maybe the challenges that you're just not aware of.
And giving credit as well is a big thing.
Absolutely.
So, if someone who, maybe you are someone who's more senior in the industry and someone who's more junior comes up with an idea, giving credit to that person. If you, maybe let's say you're like the marketing manager and you have like a marketing assistant underneath you and like a head of marketing above you, and the marketing assistant suggests something to the marketing manager takes it to the head of marketing, and then head of marketing like loves the idea, but actually the marketing manager's taking all the credit for that. I don't understand why it happens. It just does. And I would say anyone who's out there who does hold a senior position or manages people, make sure that your team is getting credit where credit's due.
Yeah.
Sometimes, to us and to some people listening, it might seem obvious, but there's so many times when it's like, you go for an idea and you say it and then it gets blown out of proportion. This whole campaign happens and you never get a say in it again because you're the person who came up with the idea and no one kind of tells you well done or pat you on the back. I speak to a lot of people that happens to, and it's always like the more junior people as well. And it's kind of like they come up with this amazing idea, whatever it is, and then it's like they pitch it to the manager because that's what you do, that's standard, and then that manager kind of takes and runs with it and you never get any credit for it. So I think as well, coming from the position, if you are more senior, or even if you just manage, even if it's one or two people, knowing that, give them credit and tell them that was a really good idea. And equally, if they come up with an idea that isn't so great, making sure that like you don't just bluntly put it to them, no, that's awful. Like, don't say that, if someone's more junior. Obviously, we're speaking from the perspective of women as well. So for a lot of women, coming from like a more psychology background, it's a lot more emotional. We have like a very emotional connection to everything we do, including jobs and professions. So making sure that if someone comes up with a not great idea, that you don't necessarily just shoot it down straight away and you say if you think it's something you can work on, saying that. Maybe if not, just say, well, that's not really the direction that we're taking with this campaign. I really appreciate that you've took the time to consider that, but this is what we'll be sticking with, kind of thing. Just acknowledging that, because I think there is that emotional connection. And I also think, all in all, really, so many people talk about women and saying, how bitchy women can be, and it's all like, all this stuff. But I think it's because it's quite emotional for a lot of people.
Definitely.
So I think it's just about making sure that we advocate for women in the right ways, whether you're senior, junior, whatever, advocating for yourself, but advocating for other people at the same time.
I think it's also as well, if you're lucky enough to be in a company like we are, that are like all about like female empowerment, all about like pushing women to do the best that they can and push to them levels of seniority. If you're in a company that pushes for that and it is all about that, like, realize that not everyone is that lucky, and and just because it isn't happening to you, just because it isn't happening within your workspace, within like your even industry maybe, realizing that, okay, well, it's not happening here, but it's definitely happening somewhere else. And it does happen. And like you say, them start to speak for themselves, really. So it is happening, and it's just kind of have to break it down like bit by bit.
And even women of different ages, like I mentioned earlier about kind of one of the biggest barriers for women is flexibility, because, if women had more opportunities for flexible working, for remote working, for flexible working hours, for all of that sort of stuff, I think that it would really help women's progression in their careers. But not only that, like you said, acknowledging that maybe, women in different companies, different like careers, different sectors and stuff are impacted differently by like culture and stuff. But women of different ages as well. Recently, there was a menopause law in the UK that was rejected, which was around basically the idea of identifying kind of menopausal women as like going through the menopause as being like a protected characteristic, because the impact that it has, anyone who kind of goes through the menopause, the impact that it can have on them is hugely significant, in terms of like their performance, like their physical health, their mental health, it's a massive thing. And considering that it's something that, sort of like over half the population are likely to go through, again, it's just another huge challenge that just isn't acknowledged. And, part of the reasoning for that was kind of, the risk of it being discriminatory towards men, which for me, it just doesn't really make any sense, because, there's nothing of that scale that men collectively experience at a particular age that they all go through that can kind of cause a detriment to their, their health, their work, their performance. So I think it's things like that as well that, obviously that's not been passed, which feels like, for me, it's quite saddening, quite disappointing. But it's those things as well that, it's at different stages of people's careers and everything, different stages of their lives. There are like so many different challenges that really need to be acknowledged. And I just think that, we employers, society just really do need to do more. There's so much work to be done. And I think that's why these conversations are just so super important.
And these days, these International Women Week and like the series that we're running is like, trying to break down that.
Absolutely.
So important. Thanks so much for joining us for another episode of the Girls in Marketing podcast. We love hearing from you, so if you enjoyed this episode, leave us a review to let us know your thoughts, and make sure you hit the subscribe or follow button to be the first to hear when our new episodes released. Don't forget, if you want to get involved with Girls in Marketing, check out our membership to join our incredible community of marketers. Think marketing resources, courses, webinars, and more. Find out more on our website or drop us a message on any of our social channels @Girls in Marketing.